for all of you for letting us come. Many years ago, decades ago, Barbara and I did a marriage workshop in Texas for out at a camp for a long weekend, and we have not been back except through the airport, so that doesn't count, does it? Since then. So it's a delightful pleasure to be with you. We've already been blessed by meeting several during early church, enjoying a delightful Sabbath school discussion with a very wide variety of points of view. This is a delightful opportunity you have in this congregation to share with one another who have very broad backgrounds and perspectives. What a privilege to be here. And especially on this weekend to be part of your commemoration of Memorial Day. You've just seen members of your own congregation who have worn the uniform of this country and served well. I am wondering if there are some of you who have served in the military of your home countries, other parts of the world. Would you raise your hands if that's the case for any of you? There were some early church. Yes, thank you very much. For us as Christians, we aren't confined by the boundaries of political divisions or national boundaries, are we? We are God's people worldwide. And for those of you who have been faithful citizens where you lived, to have served in that military, I want to acknowledge you as well. It's an important way for us to be responsible Christian citizens in the contemporary world. On Memorial Day weekend, we think specifically about those who have died, whose service is no longer contemporary and whom we cannot honor by having them stand in front of us. I wonder if there are some of you who, like Barbara and me, have had parents, or in your case perhaps siblings or other family or very close friends who have served in the military who are no longer here. Would you raise your hands if that's true for you? Yes, there are numbers of you. God rest them, as we await the eternal future which we all seek. One of the questions that comes to me as I think about Memorial Days are how we can honor those who have been part of this human history and have served faithfully and are no longer here. What can we do to respect and honor them? I read yesterday an article by a Senator Cotton from Arkansas, who served for a period of time as one of the soldiers on the old guard at Arlington National Cemetery. He was part of putting flags up by the gravestones of service members who are buried there. He was responsible with his unit for placing more than 200,000 flags in the ground by every tombstone. They marked them off carefully, 1 boot width away from the head of the stone, the flag inserted into the ground erect, in honor of the precision and precise nature of our respect for those people. But what of those of us who sit here this morning, don't have that privilege of being at that kind of ceremony, may not have participated as some of us have in burials, funerals for service members? What can we do to respect those who have died in the service of others? First of all, it seems to me that we can do things like you have just done this morning, to recognize those who are still serving, to remember and acknowledge those who have served in the past, to value the values that those who served stood for, to acknowledge in our own experiences that the freedom we enjoy to be here this morning, to express our divergent views, to gather together as international communities. That freedom is not free, but comes at the sacrifice and loss of those who have committed themselves to perpetuate these values. We can also honor those families who have dedicated themselves to supporting a service member. I meet about once a month with service members from all the U.S. services and their families who are deployed or returning from deployment in the Middle East. I tell them that we as a nation want to recognize just those who serve, more than just those who serve on the front line. But we want to recognize all of those who I call the home front warriors. Those who stand guard at home, who are the guardians of the families, the values, the investment of these service members while they are gone serving elsewhere. We also, during these times, can stand strong to defend what current and previous service members have protected. I remember the words from long ago by Thomas Paine, who said, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigue of supporting it." And President Andrew Jackson, in his farewell address in March of 1837, said, "Providence has showered on this favored land blessing without number, and has chosen you as the guardians of freedom to preserve it for the benefit of the human race. May he who holds in his hands the destiny of nations make you worthy of the favors he has bestowed, and enable you with pure hearts and pure hands and sleepless vigilance to guard and defend to the end of time the great charge he has committed to your keeping." That's quite a challenge for us, isn't it? Not to be flippant or disregard the ground on which we stand, but to remember and honor the sacrifices of others. I've never been on the front line of a battle. The closest I've been to that was on 9/11. On that day, I was in Washington, D.C. We were in the chaplain's office. I'm looking for some slides. Thanks. I was in the chaplain's office, the chief of chaplain's office in the Navy, in what was then the Navy Annex across the freeway from the Pentagon. We were called down to the chief's office when the first plane hit the tower in New York City. We've got it. Thanks, gentlemen. We stood there stunned at this, what we hoped was a horrific accident. And while we were watching the aftermath of coverage from New York City, the second plane hit the second tower. And immediately it was clear to us that this was no accident, that we were in a battle that none of us had anticipated in this intensity. We prayed together and then went back to our offices. I had a ticket for the next morning, September 12, to fly from Reagan National Airport in downtown DC back to Walla Walla to teach classes that fall. Well, you can imagine well that I did not get home on September 12, and in fact not for several months afterward. We were devoted all of our energies to trying to recover and recoup and respond in responsible ways to that horrific event. While I was sitting at the desk a few minutes after hearing about New York City, the fire alarms in our building went off. An airplane had come very close over the Navy Annex, made a huge amount of noise, and afterward there was a big thud. It was a noise I had not heard all summer long. I went out to the desk of the assistant who was working outside. Well, when the fire alarms went off and we evacuated, this is the sight that greeted us. And while we were standing there in the parking lot that morning, gathered as the evacuation plan always indicated, by offices, all of us chaplains and our assistants were all together in one place. A civilian employee in that building spotted the chaplains and came running, screaming at the top of her voice, "Is this the end of the world? Is this the end of the world?" Terrified as to what we faced. In the days and months and years since then, I have recalled what has become a favorite text of mine. In Psalm chapter 11, the psalmist writes, "In the Lord I take refuge." Good advice for moments like that, huh? Foundation for our survival in the midst of human chaos. In the Lord I take refuge. And then he goes on to kind of paradoxically say, ironically, how can you then say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bows, they set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. This world is a dangerous place. Not just because of military attacks, not just because of international conflicts, but because of challenges we face every day in the cities and streets and country roads in this land. We are beset and challenged by all kinds of chaotic malfeasance, bad things people wish to perpetrate in our world. In days like this, the psalmist says, when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? That's your question this morning. You who associate yourself as followers of God, you who remember those who have served this country, that is your question today and mine. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? For hours, more than a day and a half, I spent time at the perimeter of the Pentagon. At first, it was working underneath freeway overpasses, trying to calm the burn victims who were being brought out from this burning building. They were waiting for helicopters to fly them to hospitals where they would be treated for their burns. And the sounds and smells of that time still come back. In the Lord I take refuge. When those immediate evacuees were cared for, we set up around the perimeter of the building support centers. First aid, first responders were there. Chaplain's location was set up and organized. I noticed a man, a warrant officer in uniform, who was carrying bottles of water to first responders up and down the line around the Pentagon. And during a lull in his activity, I visited with him, asked him what he was doing here, what brought him here. And he pointed to this area of the Pentagon where the plane had hit. Pointed to that place and said, "My wife works right there. And I want to help those who are here to help her." It reminded me of a time months before when Barbara and I were both visiting in Washington, D.C. And the horrible news came that the USS Cole, a United States ship in the Gulf, had been attacked in Yemen. While it was anchored in the harbor, a terrorist boat with explosives came, blew a hole in the side of this ship, and several sailors were killed on board that ship. We were, as I mentioned, in Washington, D.C. at that time, and the bodies of those sailors were being flown back to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where they were identified and prepared for burial. When the admiral who was in charge of that operation heard that Barbara and I were in town, and knowing a bit of the story of our daughter Shannon's murder, which we'll share with you this afternoon, knowing that we knew what it was like to lose a child by violence, he asked if we would fly with him up to Dover to be with the families who were meeting their deceased sailors who were coming home.
That was probably one of the saddest and yet profoundly honoring things that we could have been asked to do. When we got to the airport at Dover, this huge plane with wings that kind of drooped, it looked sad just sitting on the tarmac. And then the back end lowers down, and here are these very, very young sailors in their dress uniforms bringing their buddies home in flag-draped coffins. It was amazing to me to see the respect and dignity, and yet know that those young kids had just seen the most tragic things happen in their lives. We were all standing on the tarmac in a line. The parents were at the beginning of the line nearest the plane, and we were toward the end of it. As those flag-draped coffins came off the plane, you could hear the weeping of the parents. And it started at the beginning. They didn't even know which coffin their own child was in, the remains of their child. There wasn't even a body. It was just pieces. I mean, what a horrible thing to have to face. The Navy band was playing the Navy hymn, Eternal Father, strong to save. After the hearses, the hearse, one for each casket, took them away, there was a reception in the airport terminal for all of the families, and we got to be part of that. It was a privilege to be able to say to some of those parents, especially the mothers, and I could commiserate, and I said, I only know a little bit of what you're going through, because my daughter came home in a box too. But it was a wonderful thing that we could connect with them and share in that moment of grief and yet profound hope and gratefulness for the freedom that we have.
Thank you, Barbara. I was part of the funeral of one of those sailors, and I had the honor of presenting the flag that had been over his casket to his parents. Freedom is not free. On September 11, a young single mother sailor left her home in Virginia, took her 2-year-old daughter to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and drove to work at the Pentagon. She was one of the sailors who supported the National Navy Center, Control Center, which was located on the ground floor. Oops, sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Ground floor of the Pentagon at the point of impact. In the Navy, every time a sailor dies, another sailor of similar rank is assigned to work with the family. And a Navy chief had been assigned to be in touch with this Virginia family. They hoped and hoped that because they had not heard from her, and a day or 2 or 3 went by and they still had not heard, they hoped that she had simply not been able to get back home, and so had gone somewhere else temporarily and would be back in touch with them shortly. But as the hours stretched into days, that became less and less possible. And one day the phone call came to the chief who was responsible for this family that her remains had been identified in Dover at the military morgue. It was fortunate for those of us who worked in Washington, because most of the 200 who were killed had DNA samples on file, and their remains could be fairly easily identified. I went to Washington, D.C. for several days, 10 days after the attack. At that time, the heap in New York City was still 10 stories high. They were using steam shovels and dump trucks to haul things away. Dogs were sniffing the debris, looking for the remains of people who had died. And because most of them were civilians and did not have any DNA markers, identifying them was nearly impossible. There was a big wall of posters families had erected in New York City. They called it the Wall of Prayer. Pictures of family members that they had not heard from and whom they were missing, hoping somebody could identify them. But in Washington, we at least had DNA, and the phone call came for this Virginia family. Whenever it's possible, a chaplain is assigned to work with those families as well, and I was contacted to be part of this notification. The chief called the family in Virginia. Father of this sailor was a retired Navy chief. And when the call went to the family, notifying them that we would be coming to see them, they knew what that meant and said on the phone to the chief, "Don't come here, we don't want to see you." They did not want this news. But protocol required us to go. So the chief and an officer who was the commanding officer of her unit and I got into a Navy van and drove to Virginia, and into the driveway of this family. I got out of the van in my chaplain's uniform. A woman came up to where I was standing, looked at my uniform, saw the Christian cross on the sleeve, which identified me as a Christian chaplain, shook her finger in my face and said, "I blame God for this, and I don't want to talk to you," and turned around and walked away. We took a few deep breaths, walked up to the door, rang the doorbell, and stood there. And stood there. And there was no answer. Rang the bell again. Finally, a young adult man came, introduced himself as a relative, and invited the three of us into the living room, where we sat by ourselves for a while. And then one after another person began to trickle into the room. Finally, there were several family members there, but the mother had still not joined us. She was in a back room by herself, and at the suggestion of one of the family members, I went to see her. A brief conversation, and she came with me to join the rest of us. And then, one at a time, we spoke. The military officer, the Navy officer, talked about how sad he was to be part of this, that he had brought other members of his unit in times past home in body bags. The Navy chief talked about the identity he had with this family because they had just lost a mother in his family to cancer earlier that year. And I shared with the family about our experience of losing a child by an act of violence, and our sharing pain with one another created a breakthrough in that home. You know, the Apostle Paul tells us that we all comfort one another with the comfort with which we have been comforted, that we share our burdens with one another, we identify with each other. And by the time we finished that brief visit, everybody in that room, family members and uniformed people as well, stood together. We put our arms around one another, and we prayed together. God sees us through tough times. In the Lord I take refuge. But it leaves questions for us, these losses, the sadness of being without people we have loved, the acts of violence that disrupt the peaceful harmony of our world. It leaves us questions about what kind of God would allow those things to happen. If God is really a loving and caring God, then why doesn't He prevent this? Why doesn't He just create a sense of peace and harmony that permeates everybody? Why does He allow war and suffering and loss and disease and pain and death? What kind of a God is this? Crucial questions that we all need to struggle with. The God I serve does not promise us easy times. You remember Jesus saying in John chapter 16, "In this world you will have trouble." Not going to be easy for you. You who affiliate with me are going to face serious challenges. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, He said. I have overcome the world. Now this is Jesus anticipating His suffering and death. This is the human Jesus before the resurrection. This is the Jesus, our brother, who said, I have overcome the world. So you have an English teacher in your congregation nowadays, Mrs. Pastor. She will tell us that that verb is a past perfect verb, right? This is something Jesus said. He didn't say, I will overcome the world. No, He said, I have overcome it. It's already true. Amen. It was not yet true. How could He say He had already done what hadn't yet happened? Because He had faith in what God had promised to Him. Amen. He looked ahead beyond the suffering that He was going to face, and in anticipation seized the prize before the end of the game. In the Lord I take refuge. So how is it that we overcome at times of pain and loss in our lives? We remember that what the righteous can do is to trust in the Lord. Amen. And in fact, this paragraph in Psalm 11 ends in what for me is a very interesting way. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you send me out there to try to hide or protect myself, to seek some kind of refuge in the mountains? There's evil all around me, the psalmist says. There's no way I can escape this. So, when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? And the psalmist's next words are, the Lord is in His holy temple. God is in charge regardless of how bad it looks. We don't honor God. We don't follow God because God keeps us from evil in the world. We honor the God who walks with us through the evil in the world. We honor the God who suffers with you and me. We honor the God who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death, so that we are not afraid in our misery. We honor the God who promises us in Revelation. You remember this text toward the end of the Revelator's book, chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. As a Navy person, I could talk about that for a little bit. I saw the holy city, The New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them and be their God." Catch this now. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, nor crying, or mourning, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus.